My name is Renata Sánchez. I'm 72 years old, and I remember the exact moment my life was reduced to a sentence. You should start preparing yourself. That's what the doctor said. Not let's fight, not there are options, just that. He stood there in his pristine white coat, holding a clipboard like it was a tombstone, his voice flatter than the tiles on the floor. I blinked. Prepare for what exactly? He didn't meet my eyes. Your condition is progressive, aggressive. We estimate you have about 6 months, maybe less. I heard every word, but what echoed the loudest was what he didn't say, what no one says out loud when you're a woman past 70. We've already written you off. When I left the hospital that day, the world felt quieter, like it was already grieving me. The receptionist didn't meet my gaze. A nurse patted my shoulder. An old man in the waiting room nodded at me with the kind of look people reserve for funerals. By the time I got home, the news had already travelled faster than I had. My daughter Marissa stood at the door, eyes red, hugging me like I was glass. My grandson Eli didn't understand, but even he seemed softer, like he was afraid to speak too loud. They cooked me soup. They sat me down. They said things like, "Don't worry about anything. We'll take care of you. Just rest now, okay?" Rest? I wasn't dead yet. But I didn't say that. Not yet. I nodded, smiled, played the part of the grateful, fading matriarch. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my coat, watching the shadows crawl across the floor. Somewhere in the next room, I heard them whispering. It's just better if she doesn't know everything. She should stay calm, quiet. It's what's best. And that's when something in me snapped, not loudly, not yet, but sharp enough to slice through every polite expectation ever draped across my shoulders. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to die quietly. 3 days after my diagnosis, Marissa brought over brochures, not flowers, not hope. Brochures. They were glossy, cheerful things with names like Tranquil Gardens and Whispering Pines, as if naming a place gently made death more palatable. I flipped through them with the same disgust I once reserved for timeshare scams. "It's just a look, Mummy," she said, trying to smile. "Just to know what's out there." I knew what was out there. A padded room with beige walls and stale pudding. Quiet halls where no one calls you by name, only by condition. I had visited enough dying friends to understand that these places didn't preserve dignity. They preserved silence. The final straw came when Marissa said it, without even looking up from her phone. "You don't have to do anything anymore. Just stay quiet and, die peacefully." It wasn't meant to hurt, I think. She said it like one says, "Just rest up." But in that moment, I realized what everyone was trying to do. Wrap my coffin with kindness and shove me in before I'd even lost my breath. That night, I sat by the window in my flannel pajamas, holding a picture of Walt, my late husband, and whispered through tears, "They want me to disappear." And I'm afraid I almost let them. I stared out at the moon, pale and unbothered in the night sky, and remembered the woman I used to be. The one who protested at City Hall when our library was defunded. The one who led fourth graders through Latin verbs with fire in her voice. The one who once ran 5 miles in the rain because someone told her she couldn't. Where had she gone? I walked to my closet and pulled out the red blazer I hadn't worn since retirement. It still smelled like old perfume and power. I put it on, looked in the mirror, Wrinkles, yes, grey hair, absolutely. But my eyes, they still burned. You're still in there, Renata, I told my reflection, and you're not done yet. I didn't sleep that night. I planned, I wrote, I searched online, I drafted emails, not for funeral homes, for volunteer groups, for advocacy centres, for writing workshops, for life. They whispered that I should fade, so I decided to roar. 2 weeks later, a letter came in the mail from the Department of Motor Vehicles. Subject: Revocation of Driving Privileges. Reason: Medical concern. It wasn't signed by a person, just a stamped name at the bottom, like my freedom could be erased by a keystroke. I stood at the kitchen table, holding the paper in my shaking hands, and felt something between fury and disbelief. I had driven for 54 years, safely, confidently. I had taught 3 teenagers to drive. I had parallel parked on Baltimore's cobblestone streets during rush hour. But now, because of a diagnosis I wasn't even feeling yet, they took the keys without asking me. "It's for your safety," Marissa said when I called. "Mum, come on, it's just time to let some things go. Let things go. My independence. My right to go to the grocery store when I want. To drive with the windows down listening to Santana." They didn't see it, but that license wasn't just about driving, it was about freedom. So I walked. I put on my red blazer, tied a scarf around my neck like it was armor, and walked to the community center 2 miles away. It took me almost an hour, but I didn't stop once. When I arrived, panting and sweating, I signed up for a public speaking class. The young woman at the desk looked at me like I was lost. "You sure you're in the right place?" she asked. "Dead sure," I said. "Put me down for Tuesday and Thursday, 4 p.m. That week, I also joined a writers' group and applied to volunteer at a senior literacy program. Every step I took, every form I filled, every word I spoke into that microphone, it all screamed, "You may have taken my license, but you didn't take me." That weekend, Marissa drove over to drop off some groceries. She looked at me, really looked, and raised an eyebrow. "Why are you wearing lipstick?" "Because I'm going out," I said, grabbing my tote bag. "Out where?" "Wherever I damn well please." She didn't respond, and that was the beginning of her learning something she hadn't realized. Renata Sánchez wasn't going quietly. It was a Tuesday morning when I found it. Marissa had come over with a box of things she claimed were just some forms to organize. She placed it on the dining table and stepped out to take a call. Curiosity tugged at me. Curiosity and a gut feeling that something was off. Inside the box, insurance papers, prescription summaries, and then beneath a folder labeled Future Planning, I found it. A glossy trifold brochure, white lilies, doves, a tagline in cursive, "Compassionate endings, pre-need funeral packages." My name was printed at the top of the client info page, my birthday, my maiden name, my preferred casket style. The world didn't spin, it paused. I felt the blood rush from my face, and not from fear, from betrayal. I had seen death plans before. Walt and I made ours together years ago. Simple cremation, no service. But this wasn't about honoring my wishes. This was about making decisions without me, about controlling the narrative of my life before it ended. Marissa came back into the room, laughing at something on her phone. I held the brochure up like it was a piece of evidence. "What is this?" She froze. "Mummy, I just thought it'd be good to be prepared." "Prepared for what? For when I stop being convenient?" She stammered. said it wasn't like that, said she was trying to be practical. But the look in her eyes gave it away. She had started imagining a world without me in it. That night, I sat with that brochure in my lap and didn't cry. Number I studied it. I analysed it like I used to analyse essays from my students. I marked it up with red pen. Too soon. No input from subject. Grade F. Then I mailed it back with a note attached that said, "I'm not done writing my story. You don't get to write the ending." The next morning, I signed up for a podcast class. A woman I met in writing group had one. She said I could come on as a guest, share my story, my anger, my fire. And I thought, if they're already planning my funeral, I might as well throw a party in the meantime. That Friday, I brewed a pot of strong coffee, lit my favourite lavender candle, and sat down at my old oak desk. The house was silent except for the ticking clock and the occasional creak of the radiator. I pulled out a sheet of paper, not a phone, not a laptop, because some words deserve ink. Some things are too sacred for a screen. At the top, I wrote, "Dear life, you tried to let go of me before I let go of you." I wrote for hours. I told life everything it had done to me and everything I had done back. I wrote about being born in Puerto Rico, raised in the Bronx, teaching high school English while raising 2 children alone after Walt died. I wrote about how the same society that once needed my strength now called me fragile and sweet, as if my age erased my identity. "You made me tough," I wrote, "then punished me for being tough, but I'm still here. And I'm not just surviving, I'm living with teeth." That letter was my declaration, not to anyone else, but to myself. I had allowed the world to narrate my chapters for too long. It was time to snatch the pen back. I folded it neatly and placed it in a red envelope. I wrote, "Do not open until I forget who I am," across the front. Then I taped it to the inside of my closet door. A reminder for whatever days came next that I had already decided. My life was mine. That weekend, I stood behind a microphone for the first time in 20 years. It was at the community centre's open mic night. I didn't read poetry or sing. I told my story. I told them about the diagnosis, the license, the funeral plans, the silence they tried to box me into. And the crowd, young, old, tired, wired, they listened. Really listened. One woman came up after, tears in her eyes. "My daughter says the same things to me. Just rest, stay quiet." I thought I was going crazy. "You're not," I said. "You're just not done." I left that night with something buzzing in my bones. Momentum. Let them plan for my death. I was planning my rebirth. The podcast studio was tucked into the back of an old bookstore downtown. The walls were lined with mismatched foam squares, and the air smelled like dust, ink, and ambition. I stepped in with my tote bag, wearing my red blazer again, my armor, my uniform. A young woman named Jess, maybe 30 at most, greeted me with a grin. "You must be Renata. You're exactly how I imagined you'd be." "Bold?" I asked. "Loud," she said. "In the best way." We laughed, and for the first time in weeks, I felt seen, not as a fragile figure of pity, but as a presence. Jess clipped a mic to my collar and asked me to speak into it like I was speaking to someone I loved, and I did. I imagined Walt, my students, even little Eli. "My name is Renata Sánchez," I said, "and I am not dead yet." I told the world what they tried to do to me. How they stripped away my choices one by one and called it kindness. How the whispers were louder than shouts. How I fought not with fists, but with decisions. The episode went live that night. By morning, my inbox was full. Dozens of messages from women, older, younger, across the country, saying, "Thank you." I thought I was the only one. You reminded me I have a voice. I played your episode for my daughter. She cried. That kind of resonance, it crackles through the bones. It doesn't heal everything, but it cements something. You still matter. Jess called me 2 days later. "We want to make you a regular guest, maybe even co-host." I almost dropped the phone. Me, a co-host at 72, the woman who they tried to fade out like background noise. "Yes," I said. "Yes, absolutely." And just like that, the woman who had once been told to stay quiet and die peacefully was now talking into a mic once a week, reminding everyone to speak louder and longer. Because silence might come for us all someday. But until it does, I will keep speaking. It started with a song. A Friday evening, I was scrolling through music on my ancient iPad, one of the few things Marissa hadn't tried to recycle. I stumbled upon a playlist titled Mom's Favorites. I didn't remember making it, but there it was. Gloria Estefan, Celia Cruz, a little Sinatra. And then, buried deep, something from my 20s, Hector Lavoe's Periodico de Ayer. The first notes hit, and I swear something in my spine straightened. My feet started tapping, my hips swayed, tentative at first. I hadn't really danced since Walt passed, but that night I pushed the coffee table aside, stood barefoot in my living room, and moved like someone who had skin that remembered. My body ached, my knees complained, but I kept going. The mirror didn't show a 72-year-old widow, it showed a woman living inside the music. And I cried, not from sadness, but from recognition. I was still here. I was still me. "You're allowed to feel joy," I whispered to myself, "even now, especially now." The next week on the podcast, Jess noticed my energy. "You're glowing," she said. "I danced last night," I replied. "Like a fool. It was glorious." That turned into a whole segment. We called it Joy Isn't Just for the Young. Listeners wrote in, sharing their own little rebellions. Seniors taking up salsa, widows getting tattoos, grandmothers going to karaoke. Something was shifting, not just in me, but in the people I was reaching. I signed up for a community dance class. The instructor, a man half my age with biceps like pineapples, looked unsure when I walked in. "You sure you're in the right room, ma'am?" "Dead sure," I said. "That's the third time you've said that this month," he laughed. "I like reminding people I'm not dead yet." And then I danced. Not like I used to, maybe better. Because this time I danced with nothing left to prove, just everything left to feel. It was a Sunday when Marissa showed up unannounced. She knocked like she owned the place, 3 quick taps, then silence. I opened the door still in my workout gear, hair tied up, cheeks flushed from dance class. She looked me up and down. "You look busy," she said. "That's because I am," I smiled. She stepped inside cautiously, like the place might bite her. I poured her a glass of lemonade and sat across from her. She glanced at the books stacked on the coffee table, memoirs, podcast notes, a flyer for a senior empowerment panel I was scheduled to speak at next month. "What is all this?" "This," I said, "is what I do now." She blinked, confused. "Mum, I thought we agreed you'd slow down, take it easy." "You agreed. I never signed that contract." Her brow furrowed, and then she dropped the pretense. "Okay, look, I was worried about you after your diagnosis." "I was worried too," I interrupted, "but you don't help someone live by planning for their death." We sat in silence. She looked smaller than usual, less like a daughter, more like a child trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. "You really think you can keep all this up?" "Marissa," I said softly, "I'm not keeping up. I'm catching up. On all the years I put my life on pause." She didn't respond, just stared at her lemonade like it held answers. "You know," I added, "you could come to the panel next week. Bring Eli. He might like hearing his abuela speak into a mic like Beyoncé." Her lips twitched, the ghost of a smile. "You're not who I expected you to become." "Good," I said, "because I'm finally who I expected to be." After she left, I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I just turned the music back on and danced around my kitchen with a spatula as a microphone, because the best revenge for being underestimated is becoming unforgettable. The auditorium wasn't big, just a community centre space with a makeshift stage and folding chairs. But to me, it felt like Carnegie Hall. I wore my red blazer, of course, and pinned on a brooch shaped like a megaphone. It was silly. It was perfect. The room was packed with faces of all kinds: teenagers, caregivers, older women in floral dresses, a few skeptics in the back with crossed arms. Jess was there, setting up sound equipment. Eli sat front row beside Marissa, twirling a pencil like a drumstick. I caught his eye and winked. Then I stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Renata Sánchez," I began, and I was told to stay quiet and die peacefully. Instead, I got loud and lived fully. A few chuckles, some surprised gasps. I let the silence settle, then went on. I spoke about the funeral brochure, about dancing alone in my living room, about speaking into a podcast mic and hearing my own voice echo back, not as an old woman, but as a woman. I talked about reclaiming my name from a folder labeled Next of Kin. "They told me to rest," I said, "but rest is something you earn, not something handed to you like a prison sentence." I didn't shout. I didn't pace. I just told the truth. And when I finished, the applause was so immediate it startled me. Afterward, people came up one by one. A teenage girl hugged me with trembling arms. "You sound like my grandma. She passed last year. I wish she'd heard this." A middle-aged man whispered, "I haven't spoken to my mother in a year. I think I should." Even the skeptic in the back. He clapped. One hand. But he clapped. And Marissa? She didn't say much. But when Eli tugged her sleeve and said, "Can we come next time too?" she nodded. That night, I lay in bed and whispered into the dark, "You did good, Renata." I didn't need anyone's permission anymore, not to speak, not to dance, not to live. The morning I walked into the attorney's office, the receptionist greeted me with a tight smile and a clipboard. I filled out the form carefully, underlining my name like a headline: Renata Sánchez, age 72, still very much alive. When my name was called, I entered a clean little room where the lawyer, a woman younger than Marissa, sat behind a polished desk. She extended her hand. "Mrs. Sánchez, I understand you want to revise your will." "Not just revise," I said. "I want to rewrite my story." I handed her the documents I had prepared, typed pages full of clauses and footnotes. She raised an eyebrow. "You've done your homework." "I used to grade essays for a living. I know how to spot lazy sentences." We laughed. Then I got serious. I explained that my current will left everything, my savings, my house, my life insurance, to Marissa and Eli. But now I wanted to make sure part of it went to something bigger. I told her I wanted to create a small fund for older women re-entering the workforce or learning digital skills. I called it the Loud Legacy Fund. Because they tried to silence me, I said, but I found a microphone. The lawyer looked moved. She adjusted her glasses, nodded, and said we could absolutely make that happen. When I got home that night, I opened a bottle of sparkling apple cider and toasted myself. To the woman they tried to erase, I said aloud, lifting my glass. And to the future she just made louder. The next podcast episode, I shared what I'd done. The response was overwhelming. One woman from Arizona wrote, "I've been thinking of writing my will for years. I always thought it meant the end. But you made it sound like a beginning." Another said, "I'm naming my garden Renata's Corner. That way I remember not to shrink." And Eli, he drew a picture of me at the microphone and taped it to my fridge. "You're like a superhero," he said. "I'm just a grandma with a mic," I told him. "Same thing," he shrugged. That drawing stays there to this day, because I might be planning for after I'm gone, but I've never been more present. It was Marissa's idea, dinner at a fancy restaurant to talk things over. I agreed, not because I needed the food, but because I was done avoiding shadows. If I could speak in front of strangers, I could speak across a table from my own daughter. I wore red again. Not the blazer this time, but a silk scarf that caught the candlelight like flame. I walked in tall, my heels clicking with purpose. Marissa stood when she saw me. Her eyes lingered on the scarf. "You look radiant," she said. Radiant wasn't a word she'd used for me in years. We sat, we ordered. Small talk filled the first few minutes. Eli's school, her job, the weather. Then came the real reason she'd invited me. "I listened to your podcast," she said slowly. "All of them." I raised an eyebrow. "All of them?" "Yes, I wanted to understand." I nodded, letting the silence do its job. "I didn't know you felt that way," she added. "That's because I spent years making sure you didn't have to. You were always so strong." Being strong doesn't mean being okay. She looked down, stirring her glass of ice water. I watched her carefully. "I guess I was afraid," she whispered. "Afraid of losing you, so I tried to control everything, even how you age." That was the first honest thing I'd heard from her in a long time. "I don't need to be controlled, Marissa," I said softly. "I need to be respected." We talked for hours. Not every word was smooth, not every wound healed. But when dessert came, something had shifted. As we parted, she hugged me tighter than usual. "You're not done," she said. "Not even close," I replied. I walked back to my car under a sky smeared with stars, feeling taller than when I entered. Not because I'd won, but because I hadn't shrunk. Because speaking your truth, even across linen napkins and empty plates, is still a revolution. I found the old stationery tucked in the back of my dresser, the kind with gold trim and matching envelopes. Walt used to buy it for me every Christmas, even though I hardly ever wrote letters. He said it suited me. A woman with elegant words deserves elegant paper. That night I sat at the kitchen table, pen in hand, and began writing. "Dear Marissa, there are so many things I wish I had said when you were younger, like how I used to watch you sleep after long days, wondering if I was doing it right. I never knew what I was doing, Marissa. I just knew I loved you harder than I knew how to say." The ink bled gently on the page. My hands didn't shake. They glided, as if the truth had been waiting years to come out. "You were the reason I kept going after your father died. Even when you pulled away, I stayed close in ways I thought were best. Maybe I got it wrong. Maybe I tried too hard to protect you by hiding how much I hurt. I paused, took a sip of lukewarm tea. Now, you've tried to protect me in return, but Marissa, I don't need to be tucked away. I don't need silence or soft landings. I need fire. I need meaning. I need the freedom to be loud and alive until my very last breath. When I finished, I didn't seal the letter. I folded it neatly, placed it in the middle drawer, and left it there. It wasn't for her, it was for me. A declaration, a release, a reminder that honesty doesn't always need an audience to matter. That week on the podcast, I told our listeners about the letter without reading it. Jess asked if I'd ever give it to Marissa. No, I said. Some truths aren't for changing people, they're for freeing ourselves. The message board lit up. I wrote my daughter a letter too, didn't send it, didn't need to. That line about freedom, I felt that in my bones. We're not alone, Renata, not anymore. Sometimes it's not the loudest things that echo longest. Sometimes it's the things we write and leave in the drawer because we finally heard them. Hospitals have a smell, antiseptic, bleach, something else, a kind of sterile sadness that seeps into your clothes and stays there. I was just there for a routine checkup, a follow-up on my heart, nothing dramatic. But the moment I stepped inside, the fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they were judging me. The nurse was young, probably no more than 25, bright ponytail, cheerful smile, and a sing-song voice that grated more than it comforted. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said, gently guiding me toward the scale. "Let's get your weight, okay?" I paused, not at the scale, at the word, sweetheart. It wasn't the first time I'd been called that by someone in scrubs, but this time it didn't land softly. This time it stung. I stepped onto the scale and looked her straight in the eyes. "I'm not your sweetheart," I said calmly. "You can call me Renata or Miss Sanchez, or even Mom if you're feeling traditional." She blinked, maybe shocked, maybe embarrassed. I didn't mean anything by it." "I know," I said, softening, "but you didn't mean me either." Later, when the doctor came in, I made my questions sharp, my tone certain. I wasn't going to be rushed. I wasn't going to be dismissed. He asked if I was still working. I said I was creating. He asked if I lived alone. I said I lived freely. I walked out of that building with a clean bill of health and a fire in my chest, not from fear, but from purpose. That week, the podcast episode was titled, "Don't Call Me Sweetheart." It struck a nerve. Hundreds of comments poured in. They always call me young lady, like it's cute. It's not. Thank you for saying it out loud. My name is Ethel, not Sugar, not Hon Ethel. We weren't angry, not really. We were done being reduced, dismissed, wrapped in ribbons of politeness that made us invisible. Because we've lived too much, lost too much, and learned too well to be anybody's sweetheart, unless we say so. The invitation came from a local college. A women's studies professor had heard my podcast through her mother, and apparently she played one of my episodes in her class. "You're quite the conversation starter," the email said. They wanted me to speak at their annual Women's Voices event. At first, I hesitated. I wasn't a scholar or an activist. I was just Renata Sánchez, a retired librarian who refused to fade away. But then I remembered the storage unit episode, the one where the woman said, "I listened from the closet, afraid my kids would hear." And I replied to the email, "Yes, I'd be honored." I didn't wear red this time. I wore bold orange, bright, undeniable. The auditorium was bigger than the last one. Hundreds of seats, a real stage, a mic with a foam windscreen. I stepped up to the podium and looked out at all the faces, young, old, tired, hopeful. They told me to stay quiet and die peacefully, I began. But peace isn't silence, and silence isn't kindness. The audience was still, hanging on every word. I told them about the funeral brochure, the nurse calling me sweetheart, the letter I never sent. I ended with a question. What part of yourself have you been silencing, and why? The applause was thunderous. Afterwards, 3 students waited to hug me. One said, I called my grandma today. I hadn't in years. But the surprise came 2 days later. A local newspaper ran a headline, Podcast Grandmother Inspires Generations to Speak Up. They used a photo of me mid-speech, hands open like I was handing my story to the world. And maybe I was. I clipped the article and placed it on my fridge, right next to Eli's superhero drawing. The 2 images didn't clash. They completed each other. Because being loud isn't about volume, it's about being heard. And being heard means being real. And at 72, I had never been more real in my life. It was a rainy Thursday, the kind of afternoon where the sky feels too heavy and the tea never quite gets hot enough. Eli was over after school, curled up on the couch with a comic book while I organised my notes for an upcoming podcast. He looked up at me suddenly, serious eyes behind smudged glasses. Grandma, are you ever scared? I paused, the kind of pause that carries decades. Scared of what, honey? Like, of getting old, of being alone? I sat beside him and pulled the blanket over both of us. Yes, I said, all the time. He blinked. Maybe he expected a heroic speech, but I wasn't going to give him a story without truth. I was scared when your grandpa passed. I was scared the day I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize my face. And I was terrified when I realized people were treating me like I was already gone. But you don't act scared, he whispered. That's because being scared isn't the same as giving up. I told him how I still feel fear before every recording, before every talk, even before dinners with his mum. But I do them anyway. Why? He asked. Because courage isn't being fearless. Courage is being scared and showing up loud anyway. He nodded, like that made perfect sense. Maybe to kids it does. Then he said something that made me sit straighter. If I get old one day, I want to be like you. I smiled, kissed his forehead, and whispered, Promise me you won't wait until you're old to be brave. That evening, I recorded a new episode. What we teach our children when we speak the truth. It wasn't about fear. It was about honesty, about legacy, about how the greatest gift we can give the next generation is not protection, but permission to be vulnerable, loud, and real. The rain didn't stop that day, but it didn't matter, because inside, wrapped in blankets and truth, a new seed of strength had been planted, and I knew it would grow. One of my listeners, her name was Darla, a 68-year-old woman from Baltimore, sent me a message that shifted something in me. Renata, I love your podcast, but my neighbor doesn't have a phone. She doesn't even know how to stream. I wish she could hear you. That one sentence echoed. I kept thinking about all the women like Darla's neighbor, unplugged, unheard, uninvited to the digital world. And so I did something unplanned. I took my mic, my fold-up chair, and my bright orange scarf, and I set up in the park. It was a Saturday, sunny, breezy. I placed a sign on the table, free listening, loud stories, come sit. At first, people passed me like I was invisible, but then a woman stopped, grey curls, cane, sun hat, and said, "Are you that lady from the newspaper?" I smiled. "Yes, Mum. Want to hear a story?" She sat, and I began. I told her about the storage unit woman, about the widow who started a salsa club at 80, about my own letter I never mailed. And soon others gathered. A few stood, one brought lemonade, someone else handed out tissues. For an hour, the park became a haven for voices forgotten. One man, older than me, whispered, "I thought I was the only one who still wanted to matter." I looked him straight in the eye. Wanting to matter never expires. A local reporter passing by stopped to take photos. The next day, the paper ran a new headline: "The Sidewalk Sessions, Stories That Won't Stay Silent." Later that night, I posted about the experience. The comment section overflowed. "My library wants to host one of these. Can you make a travel map so we can bring the stories to more towns? This is church, but louder." And it was. Because taking the mic outside meant more than just changing locations. It meant showing up, literally, for the ones who thought the world had passed them by. And maybe, just maybe, reminding them. It never truly does. If you're willing to speak. You'd think that after all these speeches, interviews, and podcast episodes, I wouldn't be caught off guard by emotion. But sometimes, healing sneaks up on you when you're wearing your house shoes and pumping gas. It was late, just past 9. I'd been at the community centre in Baltimore, running a Speak Loud circle with 8 women who had never told their stories aloud before. One of them, Bernice, had shared how her own daughter had called her dead weight. The room had been so quiet, you could hear hearts breaking. I carried all of it home, every word, every pain. I pulled into the gas station off Route 140, exhausted. The pump clicked, and I leaned against the car, watching a young couple laugh in the car beside me. It wasn't envy I felt, it was distance. Like the world was spinning just slightly faster than I could catch up to. That's when I started to cry. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears, rolling down as smooth as the gas meter clicking up. No one noticed, and that made it worse. Or better, I'm still not sure. I got back in the car and sat for a while. I looked at myself in the mirror and whispered, "It's okay. You're allowed. You're not weak. You're just full." That night, I recorded a special podcast episode from the driver's seat, with the dome light casting a soft glow. This one's called "The Quiet We Carry," because even those of us who speak loudly need a place to let the silence wash through. Because strength isn't about smiling every minute, it's about knowing when to stop and let yourself break. The next morning, I woke up to hundreds of messages. One said, "I listened to this with my back against my bathroom door. I needed to cry too." That parking lot became part of my journey, not a detour, but a destination. Because the road to living fully isn't paved with perfection, it's made of real moments. And sometimes the loudest thing we can do is let ourselves fall apart, even if it's beside pump number 3 under a flickering light. After a viral article titled "The Grandmother Who Won't Stay Quiet" made its rounds online, I received a phone call from a facility director. She spoke with a tone that sounded sweet, but wrapped in starch. "Ms. Sanchez, we've heard about your story. We'd love to offer you a room in our premier senior living community, free of charge for a year." Free. A magic word. For someone on Social Security and half a pension, it sounded like salvation. They sent a car. They gave me a tour. It had chandeliers, game nights, organic smoothies in the lobby. The staff wore matching polo shirts with names I couldn't pronounce. It looked like a retirement resort. But after the second week, I stopped feeling like Renata Sánchez and started feeling like a quiet room number. I couldn't record my podcast at night. Disturbs others. My red dresses raised eyebrows. A bit flashy for the dining hall. When I offered to lead a storytelling group, I was told it needed to be cleared with the board. One afternoon, I stood in the mirror and said aloud, "This place is lovely, but it's not mine." The next morning, I packed a suitcase and walked out before breakfast. I didn't even tell the staff. I left a thank you card and my key on the nightstand. I moved into a rented studio above a bakery in a noisy part of town. The air smelled like cinnamon and car horns. The neighbours were loud. The stairs creaked. It was perfect. Because I realised something, safety is not the same as living. Later, I did a podcast episode called When the Good Cage Still Has Bars. It exploded. I left my upscale retirement condo after this. Thank you for reminding me that comfort can become a trap. I turned my sewing room into a podcast studio. I'm 84. Sometimes people offer you cages with cushions, with chandeliers, with fruit water. But a cage, no matter how beautiful, is still a place where your wings don't fit. And I wasn't born for cages. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a grocery store flyer and a coupon for cat litter. No return address, just a shaky script that I hadn't seen in almost 2 years. My daughter's handwriting. I stood in the doorway for a long time before opening it, as if the paper might bite. It smelled faintly of lavender, her perfume from when she was younger, and still hugged me without hesitation. Inside was a single sheet, cream-coloured, folded neatly in thirds. "Mama," it began, "I don't know if you'll even read this, but I needed to say it anyway." I read every word, once, then twice. Her tone wasn't flowery, it was uncertain, human. She wrote about how embarrassed she had felt when I started the podcast, how she thought I was just acting out. She said her husband called it a phase, but then her co-worker had played an episode during lunch. "It was the one where you talked about crying at the gas station," she wrote. "I cried too, in front of everyone." She said she hadn't realised how much silence she had accepted as normal, that maybe she'd been raised to swallow words, that maybe she'd passed that habit to her daughter, my granddaughter. "I don't expect anything from you," she ended, "but I'm listening now." I didn't cry, not right away. I just stood at the kitchen table, letter in hand, surrounded by a life I'd rebuilt from bones. And then I laughed, a full belly laugh, because I knew something she didn't. Forgiveness wasn't a door she had to knock on. I had already opened it. That evening, I didn't write a podcast. I baked a peach cobbler. I hummed. I left the window open, and I whispered aloud, "You're still my girl." Later, I recorded a bonus episode. I didn't name her. I didn't need to. I just said, sometimes the words come late, but when they come from the heart, they always arrive on time. And the next day, I placed her letter on the fridge, right next to the one from Eli. 2 generations, 2 truths, and one woman still standing in between them, stronger than ever. I woke up early, before the sun had touched the bakery rooftop, before the birds began their chorus. I made my tea, cinnamon and black, and sat at my desk, where a little red sticky note reminded me. Episode 100, record today. 100 episodes, 100 stories, breaths, breakdowns, and rebuildings. What started as a whisper into an old microphone had become a movement. I had letters from Sweden, Australia, South Korea, a woman from Texas who started writing poetry again, a man from Utah who left an abusive caregiver and moved in with his nephew. All because a 72-year-old woman named Renata Sánchez refused to die quietly. I pressed record. "Hello, loud ones," I began. "This is episode 100, and it's also the last one. Not because I was tired, not because I had nothing left to say. I'm ending the podcast because it's done what it needed to do. It cracked the silence, it opened the floor, and now it's your turn to speak." I told them about the sidewalk sessions, about the time Eli asked if I was ever scared, about the gas station tears and the letter from my daughter. I told them that my greatest joy had not been speaking, but watching others begin. "You don't need a mic to be loud," I said. "You just need truth, breath, and a little courage." When I hit stop, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of voices that would rise because of the space I made. I walked outside, scarf fluttering in the morning breeze, and saw my neighbour, Gloria, watering her window plants. She smiled. "New episode today?" "The last one," I said. "Then it's just the beginning," she replied. I liked that. That night I received hundreds of messages. One read, "I never wrote my story before. I'm starting tonight." Another, "You gave me permission to be noisy." Thank you. And one, unsigned, simply said, "You saved my life." I turned off the lights and sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the city. My voice had echoed into thousands of homes, hearts, and hidden places. But the truth was, I had never needed saving. I just needed to remember. And now the world knew it too. I was told to stay quiet and die peacefully, but instead, I lived, loud, bold, and fully. And that, my dear listeners, is how I finally became free.